Hey friends, welcome to Homegrown Florida. I'm Katrina, and believe it or not, my first 3 years of gardening, I killed every single plant except for one pepper plant that just had a very impressive will to live against all of the things that I did wrong to it. But over a decade of experience now, I have kind of learned some tricks of the trade to make sure that I stop killing plants. So I'm going to share those with you today so that you can stop killing plants. The first stage of the planting cycle that we're going to talk about with all the little tricks is going to be germination or seed starting. But don't worry, we're going to get to adult plants in just a second and how I kind of avoid those issues. But when you're first starting out with seed starting, there's a lot of issues that you can have with germination. So the first being that they actually won't sprout. And that's probably like the most common one that most people start having a problem with, which is really like disheartening because it's literally the first step of gardening. I mean, you could go with starts, obviously, and if you're brand new, I definitely suggest going and getting some baby plants from the nursery. That is going to give you so much more confidence and so much more experience and get you past this phase, which is actually quite difficult when you're brand new. It is not something that is easy to do. It seems like it would be, but it really isn't. And a lot of the times people fail at this part and then they don't go on to do other things like grow the rest of the plant because they can't get it to start, right? So that's why starts are really a great option for brand new gardeners. But if you are going to try to take on the task of starting seeds yourself, which I think is great, I think it's an amazing thing to do, but there are a few things that you have to take into account. I'm not going to go into all about how to start seeds. I actually have a video that I just did on that, especially for beginners, so check that out. But I am going to tell you some of the ways that I kind of troubleshoot. I usually start them all out the same way with seed starting mix in trays, you know, with the proper planting depth. If I let these go for about, I don't know, 2 weeks and they don't pop up, generally I wait 2 to 4 weeks because some seeds take forever, like carrot seeds take like 21 days, but then other seeds like squash take like 3 days, you know. So if you give them all about 2 to 4 weeks, they should have something popping up somewhere. And if that doesn't happen, my next go-to is the paper towel trick. The paper towel trick is where you get a paper towel and you get it wet, you wring it out so it's not like sopping wet, it's just moist. And then you take one half of the paper towel and you put your seeds on that paper towel, and then you fold the wet paper towel on top of itself, on top of the seeds. And then you put that whole folded paper towel into a plastic baggie and you put it somewhere warm. Out here in Florida, our, you know, warm outside weather is pretty much warm all year round. There's only like a couple days that we get cold weather and it doesn't hold. It's like here for the night and then in the morning it's back to 70s. So for us, outside is warm enough. But warm for you might be like by your oven, not on your oven, not in your oven, but like by it or above your refrigerator, because that kind of has a little bit of warmth there. Near your, like if you have a wood stove or something, or a fireplace or something, like somewhere where it's a little bit warmer than typical. Usually around appliances is typically where you're going to see that. And then I will leave those guys for about every 3 days. I will go and I will check on them and see if they have sprouted. If they sprout, then it's not a problem with your seeds. It is a problem with the way that they're being started. But once they sprout, however young they are, you can bury them like you would bury the seed. Because once they've sprouted, they'll continue to grow and come right up. But if you wait too long and they've got leaves on them, you got to kind of bury them into the seed cell tray a little bit differently. You want the leaves to be above ground. But if it's just the sprout and you just see like the root of the sprout coming out, you can bury the whole thing and it will continue to along its sprouting progress. The downside of using the paper towel method is if you leave it in the paper towel too long, the roots will start to adhere to the paper towel, and when you try to disconnect them, you'll probably kill some of the roots. So if they do that, don't try to pull them off the paper towel, just rip the paper towel, bury the paper towel. It works just fine. It will disintegrate in like days. It's no big deal. Now, if the paper towel trick doesn't work, then I move on to my hydroponic system. I have an Aero garden inside. I've got mini Aero gardens. I don't know what's going on with that company right now, but they still are selling some, I think some of their back stock or whatever, but they haven't really been promoting any new stuff. But they say they're coming back in the spring, which it's basically spring now. So hopefully we'll hear some good news from them because I love their products. But you don't have to use an Aero garden. There's a ton of like other named, you know, hydroponic systems that you grow indoor plants in. I will start my seeds in those. If they don't work in trays and they don't work on the paper towel method, I will throw them in one of those and see if they come up in 2 to 4 weeks there. Now, I always aim to only do plants that transplant well, because if you do a plant that doesn't transplant well in there, it's going to die when you try to, you know, take it out of that and put it outside. So it really only works with items that like to be transplanted. I think like tomatoes, peppers, those kinds of things. In fact, I start a lot of my tomatoes and peppers in my arrow garden just because they just do so well. I mean, it really takes care of seedlings in a way that I feel like I can't. Now, if that way doesn't work and you've tried the 3 that I've mentioned, then you have to start looking at your time of year. Like, is it you're trying to grow them during the hottest part of the year and this is a cold weather plant? That could be it. Are you trying to start like a tomato seed in the middle of your winter and it's too cold inside your house or either outside your house? You know, that could be it. Before we ever came along, plants naturally knew when to start based on weather patterns, and they would patiently wait in the soil. So there are some plants, and I found this to be true mainly with natives and flowers the most, but it can happen with anything perennial. I will plant the seed into a tray, and if it doesn't pop up, I will just leave it. I will leave it in the tray for months. I forget about it. I set it off to the side. The most I do is make sure that it's not getting super dry. I just kind of keep it watered as best I can. A lot of the times I won't even put it out in sun because, you know, the sun will dry it off too quickly, the soil. So I will leave it right here. So you'll see a tray sitting here almost all the time in my garden because I have some seeds that I know are, like I mentioned, perennials, flowers, something like that, where they are literally waiting for something. It could be the amount of daylight hours. It could be they're waiting for certain temperature changes to occur. They could be waiting on all kinds of stuff, and they naturally know it. I don't know how they know it, but they naturally know it. And so I will just set them on a little tray and just pretty much forget about them. And a lot of times they will sprout. It shocks me sometimes that they'll sit there for months and not do anything. And then all of a sudden one day I look and there's a sprout, and it shocks me. But it does work. So that is a situation. Now, that doesn't typically happen with annuals very much. It can if you're really starting them outside of their regular schedule. So if you're trying to start tomatoes in winter, that could possibly take, you know, up to 4 to 5 weeks to get them to sprout because you're trying to grow them in very cold temperatures. So just keep that in mind, that it's not typical with annual vegetables, but it is typical with flowers, herbs, and perennials. The next thing I try is something called cold stratification. Cold stratification is basically tricking it into thinking it has gone through whatever temperature swings it thinks it needs in order to sprout. By putting it in the refrigerator. So people do this a lot of different ways, right? They'll put a seed in soil in a tray and put the tray in the refrigerator. They'll put the seed in a wet paper towel, fold it over on itself in a plastic baggie and stick that in the refrigerator. Or they'll just take the whole seed packet, not wet or anything, just the whole seed packet, and set them in the refrigerator. And you'll let it set there for anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. And then you pull them out and it thinks it's gone through winter. It's kind of the same thing as putting them in trays and leaving them out if you're in a cold area, because what you've done is it thinks that, like in nature, right? If this were to happen all without you, the plant would have dropped its seeds and it would sit there and they wouldn't sprout, because if they sprouted too quickly, they'd be killed by winter. So the seed like has some sort of knowledge in it. It's so smart. And it's like, hey, I'm not gonna sprout yet because it's not past winter. So I'm gonna wait until I feel all the cold. And then when I start feeling warm and I feel warm for a certain period of time, I am going to then sprout. That's basically what you're doing, is you're making it what somebody told me once, that's called like gaslighting the seed, like making it think that it has gone through winter and it hasn't. I thought that was really funny, but it's absolutely true. That's what you're doing. So that's called cold stratification. Once again, this is really specific to perennials, flowers, herbs, that happens with the most. It does happen with one vegetable, and that is garlic. I'm sure it happens, there's other ones, but down here in the South, I don't grow a whole lot of anything that requires cold stratification, or I try not to, because it's just something we don't get down here. It's not going to come back year after year if I have to mess with that without having to do a lot of stuff, which I don't like to do. But it does happen with garlic, and I do it with garlic. We put the whole garlic clove into the refrigerator for several weeks, and that cold stratifies it. It's wild, isn't it? It's pretty crazy. Now, last but not least, the one way that works for me if all else has failed is I will order a significant amount of seeds from wherever. You know, that could be like 2 or 3 packs of seeds. And I will go by the volume method here. That's what I call it. It's not really a method, guys. But I will take it and I will put like 100 seeds into a tray. And then I will go out in my beds and I will put 100 seeds into 1 square foot. I mean, super densely planted, right? And then, you know, we go by odds. One of them, of these 100, will sprout, right? That is what I go by. And I know that that sounds wild to do, but when all else fails and you've tried all these other ways, and trust me, all these other ways that I've discussed and you've tried and you've waited all the appropriate amount of times, it could take you like 2 or 3 seasons. I've been trying to grow cumin for years. And so I just keep like doing the same thing over and over, just buying ridiculous amounts of seeds and then trying it over and over and over. I just think it's something that won't grow in my area, but I will not stop trying until I get it right. So those are all the different ways that I try to get my seeds to germinate when they don't want to. Now the next thing is going to be around the plant not doing well or not producing well. And in fact, before we jump into that, let me share with you my book I wrote. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited, guys. It took me years. It was a labor of love. I wrote a book. It's called Homegrown Florida Gardening Guide. It has a chapter for every single vegetable. And it goes into how to grow it, how to start the seeds, how many plants you need to feed a person for a year, what kind of varieties I've grown and tested in my garden that work here in this area. It goes into cultivation, like fertilizing, watering. It goes into pest and disease management, all the tried ways that I have managed pests in the garden for that specific plant, how you should harvest it, when to harvest it, all the things you need to know about harvesting it, as well as like container gardener tips, some helpful hints, particularly around companion planting and, you know, plant families, and then all of my full color pictures, all from my garden. It did take me years because I did have to grow everything that maybe I hadn't grown or didn't have pictures for, as well as all of the testing of all of the different varieties. You've probably seen that on my channel for a couple years now, all the different variety things that I'm doing. And I have learned quite a bit from this book about varieties, and that's what we're going to talk about next. But make sure to head to homegrownfloridagarden.com, go to store, and you can pick up this ebook. I don't have it physical yet, still working on that, but we have the ebook available for you, so make sure to check that out. I'll also put the link down in the description. But varieties is the next big thing. So if you have tried growing tomatoes, this is a really common one. People will grow a beautiful beefsteak tomato, right? They see the picture on the little label and they're like, oh my gosh, I would love to have these beefsteaks. Or maybe you wanted to grow like some beautiful paste tomatoes so that you can make spaghetti sauce. And you grow the plant, it makes it past the seedling stage, it goes in the bed, it grows, it does okay, right? It starts to get some disease, some pest, and then, you know, it produces like 1 tomato, and that's it, it dies. And you're like, what happened? There's a few things that could be, but a lot of it kind of stems from variety. You know, not all tomatoes were meant to grow in all climates, right? Some tomatoes, like the ones I grow and that I tested in my book, are meant for very hot climates, very humid climates. But then there are tomatoes that don't like the heat, don't like humidity, but they want to grow in cold climates. So like our friends, our northern gardener friends up in Michigan, maybe they want to grow those instead of like the ones I grow down here. Or our friends in Hawaii, you know, they like, you know, they have a lot of humidity over there, but maybe they don't have the same level of heat, but they tend to, you know, we tend to be able to trade off tomatoes between them and us. Maybe you're out in Arizona. I just took a trip there in our RV this last fall, and it is dry there. So you need like drought tolerant tomatoes. So just because you see somebody grow a really beautiful tomato on YouTube or on TV or whatever, if they're not in your area, that tomato may not work there. Now, a lot of what you can do is go and find YouTubers like myself who are near your area. So if I'm not near your area, I do encourage you to go find some YouTubers or some blog posts or something from people who are in your area that are growing what you're trying to grow, and then look for some of the varieties that they are growing. And then you can try them out. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will grow perfectly in your garden. I follow the millennial gardener. I think he's great. He's in, I believe, I want to say North Carolina or South Carolina. He's in one of the Carolinas. So he deals with our heat, you know, he deals with our humidity, he deals with our storms, all the things that we do down here. But he had given a recommendation of growing a Caesar salad lettuce for romaine. And I've tried it 2 years in a row now, and I think it just gets too hot here. I've successfully grown lettuce in lots of different varieties, but I've been looking for like a really big romaine lettuce, and I've been, you know, hunting them down for YouTubers that are in my area. And he suggested that one. I gave it a shot, like I said, for 2 years. It's just not working for me. It just bolts every time. So, you know, even though they may be in your area or near your area or facing the same things, gardens are different, right? What works in his garden might not work in mine because of our different soil. Could be the wind that I have here that goes through the back of my beds. It could be the level of sun that he has versus I have. You know, there's a lot of things that make things different between his garden and my garden. So just because they're close doesn't necessarily mean that you're absolutely going to have the same experience, but you're going to have a much better likelihood of having a good experience if you are finding people who are in or near your area. Another really great thing is to look at University of Florida if you're in Florida, but in other states they have other universities, other programs that do all this research around, you know, different plants in your area, and they will offer suggestions as well. I think University of Florida is really good for the Florida state. So the next reason why your plant may not be thriving or happy or starting to look kind of sickly once it's an adult is nutrients. And so plants have different kinds of nutrients it needs. I think beginner gardeners don't necessarily know that you need to be feeding your plants. Now I know this is probably going to be a little controversial because there's going to be some folks out there who think that you don't need to feed them fertilizer, and that is true. But when we talk about that, we are feeding them something. We're feeding them organic mulches. We're using biochar. We're making our own compost and adding it to our beds. We're cover cropping to add nitrogen to the soil. Like, there are things that these intermediate and expert gardeners are doing to feed their plants that is not fertilizer. And that is not day one activities, guys. That is not day one activities. When you are just starting out gardening, you can get to all that later. Don't start there, because it is like, it takes a lot of effort. Well, not really. It's not a lot of effort, but it's a lot of like know-how, along with a lot of things being added and breaking down, and a lot of time. And when you're a brand new gardener, I think it makes more sense to focus on learning the plants, and then as you're growing, as you're waiting for these things to harvest and produce for you, then you can start learning about feeding the soil. I think the soil is important. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely think it's so important. But I also understand that, you know, it's not the sexy part of gardening. It's not the fun part of gardening. You kind of get into it a little bit further when you get into, you know, really like becoming obsessed with it like I am. You'll get into like really loving soil. But right now, let's just focus on growing some plants, right? And so I think that the easiest thing to start with for beginners is going to be granular fertilizer. Fertilizer is the way that the plants are being fed when you're not adding all of that organic nutrition, having all that time for it to break down and all that stuff. That intermediate expert level stuff, we're going to take that off the table right now. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about using regular fertilizers that you buy, right? And those have 3 macronutrients. Now they have a lot of micronutrients as well, and you can really focus on that. But once again, that's leading into the intermediate. What we're going to talk about is the top 3 things that they eat. Nitrogen, which is the first number. You're going to see these 3 numbers. It's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So for this, it's 5, 1, 1. With the nitrogen being a 5, phosphorus being 1, potassium being 1 as well. What does it look like when your plants are starving? When it comes to nitrogen, they're going to look like they have like really yellowing leaves. They're going to stop growing, right? They'll be sitting at the same size for weeks on end and not growing. Now, some plants grow slowly, but if you've waited 4 weeks and it still hasn't grown and it's still the same size, you might have a nitrogen issue. So nitrogen, typically what I use is something fast acting like that Alaska fish fertilizer that we just had up here. That's a liquid, so it's really quick and it delivers it immediately. At the same time that I put down the Alaskas, I'm going to put down a granular fertilizer. One of the ones I like is going to be, I really like Nutri-Rich. You get it from Azure Standard, but I know that that's not necessarily for everyone. So another one is going to be, you know, Garden Tone, Down to Earth. blood meal from Down to Earth, or their general fertilizer, their granular general fertilizer. There's also, if you're into synthetics, there's Jack's. There's the one that's probably most easy to get for new people is going to be Miracle-Gro. I'm not really big on Miracle-Gro. There's a lot of reasons behind it, company and stuff like that, but it's definitely a good option for beginners because it's so accessible. But if you can pick up one of the other ones, I think that that would be better for you. And the granular fertilizers, what's cool about them is they are going to feed you or feed the plant over a longer period of time. So if you forget to get on a regular schedule, at least the plant is fed for the season. You know what I mean? The bed might not have all the nutrients that it needs for plant after plant after plant, but if you're putting granular fertilizer in the hole every single time that you plant a plant, you're at least feeding that one for that particular season, and you don't have to be on some kind of schedule that you have to keep. So it's great for beginners. The other number, phosphorus, what that's going to look like when it has a phosphorus deficiency is it's going to be a plant that's not flowering. So this is specific to your fruiting crops. Think like your tomatoes, your peppers, your cucumbers, your squashes. If those guys are growing this big, beautiful green plant, but it's still not flowering, or it flowers and it just tiny amounts of flowers, you probably don't have enough phosphorus in your soil. That's probably one of the biggest indicators to me that I have a phosphorus deficiency in my soil, is that it won't flower. Now you can add amendments like bone meal to your soil, and that's going to help with it, or you can look for the liquid fertilizers or the granular fertilizers that are specific to fruiting plants. So you're going to see like a lot of tomato tones or flowering plants like bloom fertilizers, those kinds of things. Those are the ones that are going to have a higher number in the middle. Oh, I have one right here. Got all my liquids out. This one has 2, 4, 2. So that middle number is the phosphorus. And so that number is higher than the nitrogen and the potassium. And that's how you know that it has a higher amount of phosphorus in it. And you can use something like that. So put your liquid down just to get the plant through this horrible situation that it's going through. And then you're going to start adding some granular fertilizer. And that's when you go with the bloom fertilizers, like for flowers, or you go with the tomato fertilizers, which are generally what you use for fruiting plants. And then the last one is potassium nutrients. It really has to do with overall health and like root health, so it's a little hard to tell when it's a potassium deficiency, but it really has to do with like deformed leaves. You're gonna see a combination of like no flowering plus like yellowing leaves. Like it's gonna be a combination of like just an unhealthy looking plant. It doesn't look healthy, it doesn't look happy. It is stunted, it doesn't really want to grow. You're not making any progress. It could be a potassium deficiency. Typically what I do for potassium deficiencies is kelp meal, or you can go and look at like the kelp liquid fertilizers. Kelp has a lot of like potassium in it, which is helpful when you have that nutrient deficiency. Now, being honest here, you are just guessing at that point. You are guessing as to what the issue is. It may be displaying some of the obvious signs like yellowing leaves for nitrogen, but you are just guessing. And really the way to make sure that you are right is to do a soil test. And there's a couple ways that you can do soil tests. I used to use the ones where you bought them on Amazon online and you just kind of do them at home. I found out that those are extremely poor and they are not correct at all. In fact, it caused me to over fertilize my beds because I was using those instead of a proper soil test. And I was doing it in between because I didn't, kind of soil test is kind of a pain in the butt, but it's really a really great option to do. And there's a couple ways that you can do it. You can go through your extension office. Your extension office is a place that helps gardeners and landscaping and stuff like that. It's usually county owned, I believe. And they will tell you how you can send in your soil to them. And a lot of them do soil tests. There is a cost. It's generally inexpensive. I think in my area, I think they're $30. And you send your soil in a certain way and they have a whole website and it explains it and where to mail it and all that stuff. The other way that I do it, and I personally do it this way just because I'll explain, but I use Epic Gardening soil test. I'll put that down in the description. It's really easy because they send you everything you need and it's really simple to like put it together. It's pretty simple doing it with the county as well. The big difference is, you know, they send you a box and everything and a return label, and then you can go online and you can look at your results, and the results are very easy to read with Epic Gardening. Results with the county, not so easy to read, definitely hard to understand. It's kind of looking, it's like trying to look at blood work and figure out what's good, and you need a doctor to like translate it for you. It reminds me of that. So if you have like a lot of plant knowledge and understanding, like, yeah, definitely go through the county. You can also always call them and ask them what some of those things mean. You can email them and ask them what some of those things means, and they'll get back to you. But I feel like Epic Gardening just kind of gives you the information in a very like easy to understand way. And they also give you recommendations, like you need to put this in your soil, you need to put that, and they're very specific of what you need to put, whereas the county is just going to like give you the numbers, and then you've got to kind of figure it out. The Epic Gardening test is a little more expensive than the county's extension office, so then you just kind of have to figure out which one you want to do. I think that is a very important thing to do, because it's going to tell you pH, it's going to tell you the micronutrients, the macronutrients, all of it, and that's really important for when you're starting your garden. And it's probably one of the things that I wish I would have done first, and if I ever, you know, change gardens or move to a different area, I will definitely do that first, because it is the most important piece of information that you can have for your garden. This one actually happens quite a lot to new gardeners, and I think it's because like the pollinators in, you know, the world haven't quite figured out that you have a new garden, right? They didn't get the memo, they didn't get the, you know, the little invite, so they don't know you're there. And since they don't know that your garden's there and it needs some help and it needs pollination, and you haven't probably provided them with food like flowers, pollen, and beautiful places that they can stay that are safe, you know, those things are things that maybe come along later in the journey of gardening. Maybe you have, that's cool, but maybe you know, you haven't put any native plants in. You know, there's a lot of reasons. Maybe you don't have any fruit trees, you know, they don't have the things here that they like. And so because of that, they haven't joined or, you know, came into your garden to help you with the pollination. So in that case, if you're not seeing a lot of bees, butterflies, and other flying insects in your garden, more likely than not, they don't know you're there, and so they haven't come to visit, and then they haven't pollinated your plant. With some fruiting crops like cucumbers and squashes, it's pretty obvious when you don't have pollinators in the garden, because what will happen is people will assume that they had a fruit and then the fruit died while it was very young. This happens a lot with squash. So, and the main reason is because the immature fruit of the squash grows underneath the flower, and it looks like a baby squash is there, and it looks like, if you're, you know, not used to this, you may think, oh, it got pollinated, I just need that squash to grow. That is not the case actually with cucumbers and squashes and some other plants as well. They have a female flower and a male flower. The female flower has the immature piece of fruit, and if that male flower's pollen doesn't make it onto that female flower, that little immature piece of fruit that's sitting on the stem just kind of shrivels up and dies. That's what happens. So for some gardeners, they think that it's aborting the fruit very young, thinking that it was pollinated and that something is killing off all of their fruit. They may even think it's blossom end rot because of the way that it rots. It's actually pollination. So what's happening is your pollinators, your bees, are not hitting that male flower and then coming and hitting that female flower while that immature piece of fruit is there. It actually has the fruit there before it's pollinated. It's the oddest thing, and it really threw me off when I first started gardening. So what you have to do is, if you see that happening, if you see those little baby immature pieces of fruit just dying very, very young, rotting, turning yellow and then rotting, then you know that you have a pollination issue. If it's blossom end rot, that typically that piece of fruit is getting bigger, and it's getting bigger, but at the same time it's rotting while it's getting bigger. That's the biggest difference between blossom end rot and incomplete pollination, is that the fruit gets bigger with blossom end rot, and with incomplete pollination, it never grows beyond its initial size. So what you can do with pollination issues is hand pollinate until the little bees and everybody in the neighborhood know that you're there. And so the way that you do that is, I usually have a little paintbrush. It's my trusty old awful nasty paintbrush with so much pollen still sticking to it. But I take this paintbrush and I will go and I will, you know, dab the male flower and go over to the female flower and dab them. You can also use, if you don't have paintbrushes, you can use a Q-tip. You can actually break the male flower off and rub the center of the male flower into the center of the female flower. If you don't have any little tools or Q-tips or anything like that, you can just break that flower off and use it to paint it, is what I call it. You paint it. The pollen from one flower onto the other. That works really, really good. And you don't even need like a lot of pollen. Like I've seen some people say, oh, you need to, for every female flower, you need at least 5 male flowers to pollinate it with. That's not been my experience. Like 1 or 2 male flowers have always pollinated the female, single female. I've used a male flower and pollinated 4 or 5 different females, and it has always worked out fine for me. It's just making sure that you can get that direct connection. It happens with cucumbers, it happens with squash. Now, things like tomatoes and peppers, they are wind pollinated. It helps when you have pollinators because they buzz, and that buzzing hits the flower and it shakes the flower, or wind in your area shakes the flower. And what happens is there's not male and female flowers. There's actually one flower, and that flower has male and female parts inside the same flower. And what happens is if you get really up close, you can actually see it. If you tap a flower, you're going to see like this burst of like dust come out of the flower. That's the pollen. It's dropping from the top part of the flower to the bottom part of the flower, and it gets intermingled inside the flower. So if you get enough wind with your tomatoes and peppers, that handles it. But if it's like no wind when they're flowering, the easiest thing you could do is go by and just kind of tap the flower with your finger. Some people use an electric toothbrush. I don't think you need to go that far. I think you just tap it really good, like nice hard taps. It will push that pollen out of that flower. The same holds true for fruit trees. I had a situation kind of early on where I had a lot of flowers, but they weren't, creating fruit. And that could be because I didn't have enough bees at the time. I put in some native plants. That'll do it every time. Put in some native plants. They'll find your garden so quick. But I put in a few native plants, and then they were all here, like a crazy amount of bees, and I haven't had to worry about it since. But if you find that you have a lot of flowers on your fruit trees, but they're not pollinating and they're not becoming fruit, it could be that you don't have pollinators, and you need to get a Q-tip or a paintbrush and paint them around. Now, fruit trees don't necessarily have, well, they do. They do have male and female flowers, but it's much harder to tell them apart, especially for new gardeners. So it's much easier just to take the paintbrush or the Q-tip and just wipe any flower back and forth between each other, and you'll hit a male or a female in there, and you'll be able to spread the pollen around. So those are all the things that I have seen as a challenge for new gardeners in germinating their seeds, getting them to sprout, getting them to grow, getting them to flower, getting them pollinated, all of the things, getting a good harvest, right? All of those things could be issues that you might be having, and these are the ways that you troubleshoot them. I hope you had fun. If you learned something new, head down to the comments, let me know. Thanks for hanging out with me today while we got some seeds started. Happy gardening, guys.